going to go. Kick off? Okay, this is on. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. You're very welcome to the World Bank. I particularly welcome to our colleagues in the Inter-American Development Bank and indeed our colleagues in the IMF. We've been partnering since 2006 on the domestic abuse agenda across the organisations, and I'm particularly delighted that almost a decade later, the partnership and the work that we'll be doing is getting better, getting more cohesive, and indeed getting more voice, both within the organisations and indeed the working relationships we have. This time last year, I stood up and gave a long conversation about domestic abuse, but I actually have got some sense because I'm going to hand over to a dear colleague of mine and indeed somebody who's a lot more expert in talking about gender issues, both in relation to the client, but also as a former Minister for Finance in Indonesia, has real life experience of the impact that gender and indeed domestic abuse has for clients, but also somebody who really cares about our staff and indeed our agenda internally. Sri Mulyani Indrati has really stepped up to the point where she's challenging us as an organisation to make sure that our policies both reflect what we do externally with our clients and indeed with our staff internally. So I'm delighted to hand over to Sri, and she's going to say a few words, and then we continue on with the formats we have. So, Sri Mulyani, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And I really stand here on behalf of President Kim, who unfortunately cannot join this event. I want to thank you for being here to launch the October Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I think this is very important, and I'm pleased that country offices are all also connected via the live stream as well, because I think many of this issue of the domestic violence is also happen, especially in the country office, and for them maybe it's much harder to get the access of help because of the nature of the small office. So that's really good for them to have the access as well as to know this month's awareness. Violence is always a cause. We all know that. It has a devastating on individuals, on families, community, and even for the whole society. And it is particularly burden for women. I was involved in a recent launch of the World Bank report. The title is World Bank Group 2016 Report on Women, Business and Law. This is a series of every year that we are producing a report to identify any of the law which is identified of constraining the activity of women and girls, and women especially in business and economy. This report finds that more than 150 countries have, so this is not only developing country, 150 countries in the world have at least one law that discriminatory toward women. And in 59 countries, there is no law against sexual harassment at work. Myanmar, Uzbekistan, and Armenia are among 46 countries where there are no legal protection against domestic violence. These findings show that we still have a lot of work to do to promote inclusion, and especially when we are really care to achieve our goal of eradicating poverty and promoting shared prosperity. Discrimination and exclusion is still very real, not only in a gender perspective, but we also see in many different categories. But if we look at that, we also see it in a more or less there is a progress. There is a progress. If we look at the 1990s, very few countries had law protecting women from violence, whereas now 127 countries do partially at least in protecting the woman, because the world is more aware of the human and economic cost of mistreating women. Critics will argue that that in some countries where gender-specific law exists, the enforcement is very weak. So the law is one thing, and then the enforcement is another thing. And I'm glad that here we are going to look at the issue, especially for us to be able to not only have a good policy, but how we are going to make sure that that policy implemented so that all staff who need that kind of help will receive a help. This is true, of course, that better rule of law is definitely associated with having more gender equal law on the books, but more importantly is actually the implementation of that law. So in many countries, they even have a special court that tackle cases of act of violence against women that then can provide help with the legal action. I actually visited Brazil about a couple of months ago, and I visited a project on a dedicated train for a woman, but also all the series of services. That is becoming very, very strong because they just passed the law. They call it the Maria de Peña law. This is the law which allow for the creation of a domestic and family violence court. So they're not only, they really do get the issue of this domestic violence in Brazil is really real, and they want to really implement in a more effective way by having a dedicated court for domestic and family violence. Lebanon also adopted legislation on domestic violence and increased the length of paid maternity leave from 49 to 70 days. Well, I read the news about Amazon, which is now giving, is it full year now, maternity paid? Which is, I think, is quite impressive. Hopefully the whole United States is doing the same thing, I guess. I'm not commenting for this country. In Peru, new legislation was introduced that covers sexual harassment in public spaces. And in Hungary, economic violence has been criminalized as a form of domestic violence. So what is the cause of this domestic violence? The conservative estimates of lost productivity because of this domestic violence range from 1.2% of GDP in Brazil and Tanzania, and in Chile, the estimation even higher, that is 2% of GDP. This is roughly equal to what most governments spend on the whole primary school or primary education. So it's a huge cost. 2% of GDP, as a former finance minister, that's really a lot for a country to have that big cost because of this domestic violence. Here in the United States alone, the victim of intimate partner violence lost a total of 8 million days of paid worker each year. This is exceeding 8.5 billion per year. I think this is really a very big magnitude. If you look at the contribution of the United States to the IDA, our poor country program, this is even bigger. So you can imagine that this is really a big loss. So we don't have to say that this is economically costly, but definitely this is morally wrong. It is illegal. And definitely also, of course, economically costly for any country. So protection from violence is therefore a very critical for development. We take this issue very seriously, but not only in terms of our engagement with the client country. In fact, actually, I just last week in India, and we are also pleased because they introduced me to try a train with a dedicated cart for women. And I ride that train and I have a lot of chat with many of the women passengers. They really actually love it to have this dedicated woman train passengers. But we are actually engaging with many countries and try to make sure that addressing the issue of gender equality. But as Sean mentioned, it will not be credible for the bank to do all this development program with our client country if we are not walk the talk. So internally within the bank, I think we also have to make sure that our institution provide a good not only policy but also protection for our staff. We cannot say that the environment which is safe for women is only applied and advocated to our client country, but should be also practiced here in this institution. At least 1 in 5 women will suffer from domestic violence in her lifetime. That's really a very big 25%, 1 in 5 women. But I'm not talking about women. I don't want to make all men here feel bad, because sometimes men also are affected by the domestic violence. So while I'm actually advocating many of these women equality, gender equality, I'm not saying that this is only the problem of the woman. So that's why the title domestic violence is not telling about woman which is a victim of domestic violence. We just said domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So whoever the victim, whether this is woman or man or children, they are really the victim that we really need to be very careful. That statement, the domestic violence or intimate partner violence impact all the socio-economic sectors as well as the economy, and also even impact the culture. It is not only developing country problem in which the World Bank work and engage, but actually many of our shareholders, that is the advanced country, also still facing. And abuse can take various forms. This is not only physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and financial abuse. So when we talk about abuse, it's not always physical. Emotional and psychological as well as financial is actually equally also serious. And those who impacted usually have to hide, sometimes make excuses, and live in a constant fear and uncertainty. They are often unable to leave the relationship because of lack of social or family support, economic or emotional dependency, or even in this case, religious belief or cultural issue, feeling of shame, or fear for themselves and for their children. So the victim in this case is even worse because they feel that they don't have any option in their life. They cannot escape for whatever reason. And this is why I'm proud that the World Bank Group, together with the IMF and the Inter-American Development Bank, partner with us on domestic abuse prevention. And this is a model for best practice and has a robust and holistic domestic violence prevention program. I really encourage those who may need support to not be ashamed and not to reach out for support from this group, or from wherever. You can talk to whoever, your manager or friends, and your manager and your friend is going to contact this group. I really, really want to encourage those who really need it not to be ashamed to reach out to us. I also expect that all managers here in the bank to actively support any staff in crisis, and also to show them how to seek help. I actually, in one conversation with one of ED, saying, they receive a phone call from somebody, and I said, do you really know that we have this institutional mechanism? So I think information sharing is very important, so that everyone who then receive this kind of story or complaint, they can actively help by contacting you all. Well, I want to thank Elizabeth Lagrange as well as Stuart Fisher, who also heading our domestic abuse prevention program. For me, as a managing director and CEO of the bank, I wish our institution don't have any domestic violence, so that we don't have this program in this institution. I really wish. But I think I really thank that we have this program, because we know that when there is a violence, then those people, those staff can really get help 24 hours, 7 days a week. So I really appreciate your dedication, your passion, and really like your attention to this unit, which is very critical for us as an institution, not only care about the gender equality, talking with our client, but most importantly, we walk the talk. So with this, I would like to hand over to Stuart Fisher for the next. Thank you very much for having this kind of program.
Thank you, Shri Miliani, and thank you, Sean. And thank you all for coming here today. As Shri Miliani said, I'm the senior psychologist in the Health Services Department's counseling unit and program manager for the Domestic Abuse Prevention Program. I'd like to thank the Staff Association, Corporate Security, and WBFN for partnering with us today to bring you today's program. The Domestic Abuse Program is led by Elizabeth Legren, who as its coordinator works closely with our partners at COPE, Inc., and the lawyers at DV Leap. For those of you who don't know, that's the Domestic Violence Legal Empowerment and Action and Appeals Project. I always stumble over that. To ensure that our clients receive a broad array of services. Providing considerable guidance and wisdom is our advisory committee, the members of which include colleagues from legal, ethics, the Staff Association, HR, WBFN, the Ombuds Office, and Corporate Security. And I believe that representatives from nearly all of these groups are here today, and our work would not be possible without them. The program, which was initiated in 2000 by former President Wolfenson and tirelessly advocated by the WBFN, has lent confidential support to countless staff members, spouses, other dependents, and family members over the course of the past 15 years. The WBFN's Barry McIsaac Emergency Fund, established by Mrs. Wolfenson, allocated $11,000 to spouse victims in the past year alone. And I must note here that the WBFN has no ability to fundraise, and this fund survives on donations alone. Since 2010, the utilization of the program has nearly doubled, and in the past year, over 100 bank group staff and spouses were provided with confidential support. 95% were women, 65% were staff, and 10% were from country offices. That said, we recognize the need to increase our outreach to the country offices, and we intend to scale up our support in the coming years. We also recognize that consistent attention is needed to ease the difficulties encountered by trailing spouses. We see the need to mitigate as much as possible the potential negative impact on their careers that results from their choice to accompany their spouses, whether it be to Washington or to country offices where they often encounter difficulty with or even prohibitions against working. We know that some male spouses who were abused do not seek help due to the stigma associated with it, and we want to provide assurance that the bank recognizes these challenges and provides a safe space for men to come forward and get the help that they need. So now I'm going to turn to our speaker. I'd like to tell you, or take a few minutes to tell you a bit about Mark Levine. Mark is the Democratic Party nominee for the 45th District of the Virginia House of Delegates. He won a hotly contested primary, but seeing as that he has no opponent in November, he is extremely likely to be his district's next state representative. Although this will be his first elected office, he is no stranger to public office and public issues. He served Congressman Barney Frank as his legislative counsel, and he has been a talk radio host and a television pundit for more than a decade. You may have heard his radio show, The Inside Scoop, or seen him on News Channel 8 or Fox News. With an economics degree from Harvard, a Fulbright scholarship in Switzerland, and a law degree from Yale, Mark began his career as a private trial lawyer, but he quickly took an interest as a citizen activist in constitutional, civil rights, and other policy issues. For example, he was instrumental in drafting Washington's marriage equality law and shepherding it through the legislative and judicial process. But the reason that Mark is here today is because of his dedication to helping survivors of domestic violence. Unlike his other work, Mark did not choose this cause. It came uninvited to his family. In 1996, his sister was murdered by her husband, who was not convicted until 10 years later. His lengthy crusade to get justice for his family and to bring his niece and nephew home from a father who had killed their mother took him to legal battles in Tennessee, Illinois, and Mexico. The legacy of this hard-won fight is a series of laws that Mark wrote and cases that Mark won to help survivors of domestic violence and their children all across the country. He is determined to change public policy so that Virginia families will have the legal protections his sister and her family did not have 10 and 20 years ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Levine.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Elizabeth, Sri Mulyani, Sean. It's quite an honor and a privilege to speak here at the World Bank. You folks, for 70 years, have helped billions of people worldwide. Wow. You do every day what I strive to do on my best days, the impossible, and sometimes achieve it. The bank, of course, is trying in 15 years the very modest goals of ending extreme poverty worldwide and helping the poorest 40% of every population of every country on the planet. Okay, not very modest goals. But in the midst of all of this, I was interested to hear Sri Mulyani talk about the GDP cost of domestic violence. But really, when you think about it, your goal of ending poverty is really just to make people better off. Money is some arbitrary unit. Its only value is in people's well-being, in their health care, in their shelter, in food, in education. And part of that well-being is being free from the fear of violence. Now, we all know there's violence worldwide. There's violence on the basis of religion and race and culture and language. A lot of violence localized in various locations. We see it on the news all the time. Domestic violence, unlike that horrific violence, is not on the news very often. It really isn't. And yet domestic violence, unlike the other violence, which is serious and severe and we need to combat, it's in every country on earth. I think it's easy for us to say, oh, well, the developing countries, and we can talk, and we should talk about domestic violence in developing countries. We should talk about cultural misogyny, about the ways that women are kept down in developing countries all over the world. We need to talk about that. But we shouldn't do it with any form of presumptuousness, because it happens right here. It happens in every country on earth. Of course, it happens in the United States. As Sri Mulyani mentioned, 1 out of 5 women in the United States will suffer from either domestic violence or sexual violence in their lifetimes. It doesn't matter if I have a purple band or a green band, it's really all the same as far as I'm concerned. And that means many of you in this room have been the victims, the survivors of violence. I suspect your colleagues don't know that. You tend to know when your mother, your daughter, your wife, when you are the victim of this violence, but your colleagues don't tend to know. You don't tend to know that the woman at the grocery store or the one at the church. I realize it's not just women. It does happen to men. It does happen in same-sex partnerships, but let's be honest here. The vast majority of domestic violence is men against women, and it's as old as humankind. It's existed throughout history. It's existed in every country. So let us not think, if it hasn't happened to you or your family, that's fantastic. But keep your eyes open. I think there's a tendency to think of domestic violence, that happens to people over there. That happens to people in other countries. That happens to poor people. That happens to people of a different race or religion or culture than my own. Doesn't happen in good families. Well, it happened to mine. I come from a very good family. I have wonderful, loving parents. I grew up in an upper middle class background in Nashville, Tennessee. My older sister became an artist. She painted wonderful, colorful paintings and did graphic art and newspapers. As a kid, she kept her nerdy little brother from getting too nerdy. She'd teach me how to dress and teach me the latest pop music, and I was very close to her. In August 1996, my sister was married. She had 2 children. My niece was then 2. My nephew was then 6. And you know what? I meant to time myself, so I didn't go over. I probably should start that. So I will do that now, even. I'll try not to go too far over. My sister was living in Nashville, Tennessee. She had trouble with her husband. She had planned a divorce. She told me in June of 1996 that her husband threatened to kill her. Both of us were very angry by what he said. Neither of us ever thought he would do what he said. But the day before she had an appointment with a divorce attorney on August 16th, 1996, on August 15th, 1996, my sister was never seen again. She went missing, and her husband dropped the kids off at my parents', who took care of them, as they had done for a long time. He had other things to do, I guess, for a month. He had to clean his house. He had to clean his car. In any case, about a month later, he came to my parents' house. He was not happy that we had gone to the police to report my sister being missing. He offered to sell visitation with my niece and nephew to my parents, to give these grandparents access to their grandchildren at a high cost. Literally, he was treating them as hostages. And when they refused to pay the ransom, he skipped town. He ran to Illinois. Now, I come from a family of lawyers. I'm a lawyer. My father's a lawyer. We can go to Illinois. We can hop on a plane. We sued for visitation there. And we took a long time. Grandparents have very few rights in America. It's weird. If a woman actually in the United States has significant rights as long as she's alive. And in fact, if she's injured, if my sister had been injured, probably she could have gotten the kids, escaped, and turned out okay. But since she was murdered, we, the remaining family, her brother, her parents, we were fighting for those kids, and we had very few rights. We were grandparents' uncle. We weren't the parent. The parent was a murderer. In any case, the day we were to get visitation in Illinois, after several years of trying, my former brother-in-law skipped off to Mexico. Now that made things a lot harder. I don't speak Spanish, neither does my family. The Mexican legal system is infinitely different from the Anglo-American system. It's not like learning Illinois law. And Mexico, to be honest, I learned, has a very corrupt and dangerous legal system. My former brother-in-law set up a little bit of a mafia. He became his own sort of warlord down there. He made a lot of money cheating American expats, gringos, usually the elderly, by defrauding them for millions. And he had his own group of bodyguards to stop and intimidate anyone who would try to stop him. There was a sealed indictment for the murder of my sister, but it was sealed. It was sealed. The authorities, I understood why. They didn't want to let him know about the murder indictment because, well, he might escape to a country further away. It took us about a year to navigate the Mexican legal system. It was very hard to do. I think we found the only non-corrupt judge in all of Jalisco, Mexico. She was new, and I don't think it's a coincidence that she was the only woman on the court as well. She enforced the Illinois law, and we brought the children home. But not for long, only for a year. My former brother-in-law, also being an attorney, took us to court. He used the Hague Convention that's supposed to protect against child abduction, and he used it against us. Instead of him having abducted the children of Mexico, a place where they never lived before, none of us had ever lived before, we're not Mexican, he argued that we had abducted the children by bringing them back to the United States. The American courts agreed with him. I have a case from federal district court. We had gotten a wrongful death civil suit against him. Like I said, they couldn't try him for murder because he was in Mexico. Mexico wasn't extraditing him. And in fact, had he come to court to physically present himself in Tennessee to challenge our taking the children, No doubt he would have been arrested and put on trial. No doubt he knew that. He did it all from Mexico. But even though we had proved in civil court that he had murdered my sister, the district court judge scoffed at our, quote, contention, that my parents' contention, that killing their daughter somehow has taken on the dimension of child abuse. The court said, the Levines, my parents, do not allege that this abuse that began in 1990 and ultimately killed her in 1996, they don't allege it took place in front of the children. Instead, they argued the alleged killing of the children's mother has deprived them forever of her love, affection, attention, devotion, and guidance. That's not enough. Apparently, killing the children's mother is not enough. You have to leave her lying, bleeding in front of her children for this court to care. The children weren't touched physically. I do remember my nephew searching his kindergarten classroom, refusing to leave the art teacher because he thought that his art teacher might know where my sister, the artist, was. I remember my niece, age 2,